Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're stepping into a quiet kitchen where a mother hasn't baked her son's favorite pie in years because he stopped coming home. But when a little girl with flour on her nose whispers, "I'm making this for Daddy James," everything changes. Sometimes healing doesn't come from grand gestures, it comes from one simple apple pie. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. The morning moved slowly through the house, the way time only passes in homes that have grown accustomed to silence. Sunlight filtered through the wooden window frames in soft golden ribbons, stretching across the worn floorboards where old scratches told stories of years gone by. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light, suspended in the stillness like tiny memories floating through the air, waiting to be remembered or forgotten. James was out on the porch, bent over an old wooden chair that had been wobbling for longer than anyone cared to remember. His hands moved with deliberate slowness, tightening screws, sanding rough edges, doing the work that needed to be done. It was the kind of task that required just enough attention to keep his mind anchored to the present, to prevent his thoughts from drifting back to places too dark and too distant. He had learned long ago that idle hands were dangerous for a man with his memories, that the mind needed occupation the way lungs needed air. So he fixed things: chairs, fences, loose hinges, broken steps. He fixed whatever he could find, because fixing things made him feel useful. And feeling useful was sometimes the only thing standing between him and the shadows that waited at the edges of his consciousness. Inside the house, Tu Diep stood quietly by the door, watching him through the narrow gap between the frame and the wood. Little Ly rested in her arms, the child's weight warm and familiar against her body. Tu Diep's eyes followed the curve of James's back as he worked, tracing the lines of his shoulders, keep the world out. But she could still see the invisible marks he carried, the scars that didn't show on skin but lived somewhere deeper, in the places he never spoke about. She wondered sometimes if he would ever tell her everything, if he would ever trust her enough to show her all the broken pieces he kept hidden. And then she wondered if it even mattered, because she had already decided to love him, broken pieces and all. The sound of footsteps behind her made Tu Diep turn. James's mother emerged from the kitchen, carrying a small wicker basket in her weathered hands. The older woman's face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from years of worry and hope intertwined, from loving a son who had spent most of his life running from something she could never fully understand. She paused beside Tu Diep, her gaze drifting to the porch where James worked, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with the weight of things unspoken, of emotions too complex for simple words. When James's mother finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the house. She asked Tu Diep if she would like to do something for James, something special, something that might remind him of the boy he used to be before the world had hardened him. Tu Diep looked up, surprised by the question, but then she nodded, understanding without needing explanation that this was an invitation into something sacred, a doorway into the past that James's mother was offering to share. Little Ly looked between the two women with curious eyes, too young to understand the significance of the moment, but old enough to sense that something important was happening. They moved together into the kitchen, a small room with walls painted the color of cream and sunlight, where copper pots hung from hooks and the window above the sink looked out onto a garden that had seen better days. James's mother placed the basket on the worn wooden table and began to unpack its contents. Red apples tumbled out, their skins bright and glossy, catching the light like small treasures pulled from the earth. The color was so vivid against the aged wood of the table that it seemed almost unreal, like something from a painting or a dream. Tu Diep reached out and touched one of the apples, feeling its smooth surface beneath her fingertips, and something in her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't quite name. James's mother began to speak, her words coming slowly, as if she were pulling them from a place deep within her memory. She told Tu Diep about the apple pie, about how James had loved it as a child, how it had been his favorite thing in the world. Whenever he was sad, she said, whenever the world became too heavy for his small shoulders, he would sit in this very kitchen and wait for the pie to bake. He didn't need to eat it right away, he just needed to smell it, needed to breathe in the warm scent of apples and cinnamon as it filled the house, wrapping around him like a blanket, like a promise that everything would be all right. Her voice wasn't sad exactly, but there was a space in her words, a pause that stretched longer than it should, and Tu Diep understood that this was a mother remembering a son she had lost in ways that had nothing to do with death. Little Nye's eyes widened with excitement when she heard the words apple pie. She bounced in Tu Diep's arms, her small voice rising with enthusiasm as she declared that she wanted to make the pie for Daddy James. The word Daddy hung in the air for a moment, unexpected and beautiful, and Tu Diep felt her heart catch in her throat. She had not taught Nye to call him that. The child had chosen the word herself, had claimed James as her own in the simple, uncomplicated way that only children can. Tu Diep glanced toward the window, half expecting James to have heard, but he was still on the porch, still bent over his chair, oblivious to the small revolution happening in the kitchen. James's mother smiled, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face, smoothing away the years and the worry until she looked almost young again. She leaned close to Tu Diep and Nye, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she suggested they make it a surprise. Little Nye immediately pressed her finger to her lips, her expression becoming comically serious as she whispered the word secret with all the gravity of a child entrusted with something precious. The three of them huddled together like conspirators planning something wonderful, and in that moment the kitchen felt less like a room and more like a sanctuary, a place where love could be measured in flour and sugar and the careful peeling of apples. The work began. James's mother guided them through the recipe, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had made this pie 100 times before. The apples were peeled, the skin curling away in long spirals that Nye tried to catch before they fell to the floor. The fruit was sliced thin, each piece uniform and perfect, ready to be transformed into something greater than the sum of its parts. The scent of cinnamon began to drift through the air as the spice was measured and sprinkled, mixing with the sweet sharpness of the apples until the kitchen smelled like autumn, like comfort, like home. Tu Diep mixed the dough while James's mother told stories, her voice weaving through the kitchen like another ingredient in the recipe. She spoke about James as a boy, about the way he used to run through the garden, about the time he tried to climb the apple tree and fell, scraping his knees so badly that she thought he would never stop crying. But he did stop, she said, because she promised him apple pie, and he would do anything for apple pie. Her words painted pictures of a childhood that Tu Diep had never witnessed, a James she had never known, and with each story she felt herself falling deeper in love with him, with all the versions of him that existed across time. Little Nye stood on the stool beside the table, her small hands covered in flour, her face dusted white like a tiny ghost. She giggled as she worked the dough, making a mess that no one minded, creating chaos that felt like joy. Tu Diep laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness, and she realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this free, this unburdened by the weight of the past. For so long, her life had been about survival, about protecting me, about building walls to keep danger out. But here, in this kitchen, with flour on her hands and the smell of apples in the air, she felt something shift inside her, felt the walls begin to crumble just a little. James's mother watched them work, her eyes soft with an emotion that went beyond happiness. She saw her kitchen, once so empty and quiet, now filled with noise and movement and life. She saw the woman her son had chosen, strong and gentle in equal measure, and the child who had somehow become her granddaughter without any blood between them. She saw the broken pieces of her family, scattered for so many years, slowly finding their way back together, fitting into new shapes that were different from before, but no less whole. And she understood in that moment that healing didn't always look the way you expected, that sometimes it came disguised as flour on a child's nose and laughter in a sunny kitchen. As Tu Diep rolled out the dough, James's mother continued to speak, her words becoming quieter, more personal. She confessed that after James grew up, after he left home and stopped coming back, she had stopped making the pie. There had been no one to make it for, no one to sit in the kitchen and wait for the smell to fill the house. The recipe had sat unused for years, gathering dust in her memory like the chair James was fixing on the porch. But today, she said, today felt different. Today felt like the right day to remember, to bring something back from the past and offer it to the present, like a gift. Tu Diep's hands slowed on the dough, and she looked at the older woman with eyes that held no pity, only understanding. She knew about loss, about the empty spaces that people left behind when they went away. She knew about waiting and hoping, and eventually learning to live with absence. She didn't offer words of comfort, because some sorrows didn't need comforting. They just needed to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be told that they were real and that they mattered. So she simply nodded, and that nod contained everything she couldn't say. Little Ly, unaware of the heavy currents flowing between the adults, focused all her attention on the task at hand. She arranged the apple slices on top of the pie with painstaking care, her tongue poking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Each slice was placed with deliberate precision, as if the fate of the world depended on getting it exactly right. When she finished, she stepped back to admire her work, her face glowing with pride. She announced in a soft voice that she had made it for Daddy James, and the innocence of her words fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water, sending ripples of emotion through everyone present. James's mother turned away, moving toward the window with the pretense of checking on something, but not before Tu Diep saw the redness in her eyes, the tears she was trying to hide. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but when she turned back, she was smiling, a real smile that reached all the way to her soul. Some tears, Tu Diep realized, were not about sadness at all. Some tears were about fullness, about hearts that had been empty for too long, suddenly overflowing with more love than they knew how to hold. The pie was placed in the oven with ceremony, the door closing with a soft click that felt like the beginning of something. The three of them stood together in front of the oven, watching through the glass as the pie began to transform, as the apples softened and the crust turned golden, and the magic of heat and time worked its ancient alchemy. Little Ly pressed her hands against the warm glass, her breath fogging the surface as she whispered words of encouragement to the pie, telling it to be delicious, telling it to make Daddy James happy. Outside on the porch, James paused in his work. He straightened up, his hand going to the small of his back where the muscles had begun to ache, and he looked toward the house with an expression of vague curiosity. He didn't know why, couldn't explain the feeling that had suddenly bloomed in his chest, but something felt different. The air seemed warmer, softer, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. It felt like anticipation, like the moment before a surprise, like being wrapped in invisible arms. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling as imagination, and returned to his work. But the warmth remained, settling into his bones, refusing to leave. The afternoon light had shifted by the time the pie was ready, the sun moving lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. James finished his work on the porch and wiped his hands on his jeans, satisfied with a job well done. The chair stood steady now, all its wobbling cured, ready to support weight again. He felt good, the kind of good that came from honest labor, from fixing something that had been broken. He climbed the steps and pushed open the door, stepping into the house without any idea of what awaited him. The smell hit him first, stopping him in his tracks before he had taken 3 steps. It was a smell he knew intimately, a smell that had lived in his memory for decades, buried so deep that he had almost forgotten it existed. Apples and cinnamon and butter and warmth, all woven together into a fragrance that reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with gentle, insistent fingers. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mind reeling, his body suddenly weak as memories flooded through him. Memories of a kitchen much like this one, of a mother's hands rolling dough, of a small boy sitting at a table waiting for the world to become bearable again. Little Ly broke the spell. She came running toward him, her small feet thundering on the wooden floor, her face alight with excitement. She grabbed his hand with both of hers, pulling him toward the table where the pie sat in the center like a crown jewel, still steaming slightly, golden brown and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. She shouted the word surprise with all the force her small lungs could muster, bouncing on her toes, barely able to contain her joy. James looked at the pie, then at his mother, then at Tu Diep. His eyes moved between them, searching for explanation, searching for understanding, finding only love looking back at him from 3 different faces. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. He felt something crack open inside him, something that had been sealed shut for longer than he could remember. And before he could stop them, tears were spilling down his cheeks, falling freely, falling without shame. He moved to the table and picked up the knife, his hands trembling slightly as he cut the first slice. He placed it on a plate and handed it to his mother, then cut another for Tu Diep, then another for Ly. Only then did he cut a piece for himself. He sat down at the table, surrounded by these 3 people who had somehow become his family, and he took a bite. The flavor exploded on his tongue, exactly as he remembered, exactly as it had been all those years ago, and he had to close his eyes against the force of the emotion that swept through him. He spoke without opening his eyes, his voice rough and broken. He said that he had thought everyone had forgotten. He said that he had believed this part of his past had been erased, that the boy who loved apple pie had ceased to exist long ago. His mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and steady and real. She told him that no one had forgotten, that no one could ever forget. She told him that today was simply the day they had found the courage to love him in the simplest way they knew how. The 4 of them sat together as the afternoon light faded into evening, as the sky outside turned from gold to pink to deep velvety blue. They ate the pie slowly, savoring each bite, making the moment last as long as possible. No one spoke much because words weren't necessary, because everything that needed to be said was being said through the act of sharing, through the simple presence of being together in this small kitchen at the end of a long day. James looked around the table at the faces of the people he loved, at his mother who had never stopped waiting for him, at Tu Diep who had chosen him despite everything she knew, at little Ly who had given him a name he never thought he would deserve. And he understood something that had eluded him his entire life. He understood that healing didn't come from grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It came from kitchens filled with laughter, from small hands covered in flour, from secrets whispered between people who loved each other. It came from apple pies baked with intention, from slices cut and shared, from the courage to love simply and completely. The apple pie sat in the center of the table, growing cold as the evening deepened, but no one moved to put it away. It had become more than food, more than a recipe passed down through generations. It had become a bridge between past and present, between pain and hope, between the boy James used to be and the man he was becoming. It was a reminder that some things, no matter how deeply buried, never truly disappear. They wait. patient and faithful for the right moment to resurface, to remind us of who we were and who we can still become. And for James, sitting in that kitchen with apple pie on his tongue and love in his heart, that moment had finally arrived. After all the years of running, after all the walls he had built and the distances he had traveled, he had found his way back to a place that felt like home, not because of the house or the town or even the memories, but because of the people gathered around him, the family he had pieced together from broken parts, the love that had found him when he least expected it and refused to let go. The night settled over the house like a blessing, quiet and dark and full of peace. And somewhere in the kitchen, the scent of apples and cinnamon lingered in the air, a fragrance that would stay in the walls for days, a reminder of the afternoon when 3 people baked a pie and healed a heart, one thin slice of apple at a time. On a quiet morning filled with golden sunlight, James works alone on the porch, fixing an old chair, keeping his hands busy so his mind won't wander to darker places. Inside, his mother approaches Tu Diep with a gentle request to bake an apple pie, James's childhood favorite that she hasn't made in years since he stopped coming home. Together with little Ly, the 3 create a secret surprise in the warm kitchen. Flour flies, cinnamon fills the air, and stories of young James emerge. When Ly carefully places each apple slice, whispering, "I'm making this for Daddy James," tears quietly fall. The moment James walks in and smells the pie, decades of walls crumble. As 4 people share imperfect slices around a simple table, they discover that healing doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with love baked into every thin slice of apple.